On a quiet afternoon in the late 1980s, a teenager asked his grandfather a simple question. "Grandpa, did you ever go to war?" The old man paused. He was sitting on a porch in the American Midwest, the kind of place where the days move slowly and nothing much seems urgent. He stared out at the yard for a long moment, then finally said, "Yeah, I guess you could say that." That was it. No stories, no details, no dramatic pause. The teenager wouldn't learn until decades later that the man sitting in that chair had fought in 3 different wars: World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. Not as a general, not as a politician, but as a regular American soldier who just kept getting sent back. And like many men of his generation, he almost never talked about it. This is the story of one of those men. Not a single famous hero, but a type of soldier who existed quietly in the background of the 20th century. A man who survived battles across 3 wars, watched entire generations come and go, and carried memories he rarely shared, if he shared them at all. The First War, World War II. He was born in the early 1920s. Like millions of American boys, he grew up during the Great Depression. Work was scarce, money was tight, and nobody talked much about feelings. You worked, you helped your family, you didn't complain. By the time he turned 18, the world was already on fire. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, everything changed overnight. Recruiting offices filled up almost instantly. Some men volunteered out of patriotism, others out of pressure. Some just didn't see another option. He enlisted in the US Army in 1942. He was barely out of his teens. Training was fast, brutal, and efficient. The Army didn't have time to ease anyone into it. Within months, he was shipped overseas, first across the Atlantic, then deeper into Europe. He would later say, very casually, that Europe was cold. That's how he described fighting through places like France and Germany. Cold. He didn't talk about the fear. He didn't talk about the sounds. He didn't talk about what it was like to see towns destroyed or to walk past bodies that nobody had time to bury. He served as an infantryman, the kind of soldier who walked everywhere and carried everything on his back. He marched through muddy fields, slept in foxholes, and learned very quickly that survival often came down to luck. He was there when the Allies pushed into Germany in the final year of the war. He saw cities reduced to rubble and civilians wandering through the ruins. He saw soldiers younger than him die before they ever really lived. When the war ended in 1945, he was 23 years old, and he thought he was done. After World War II, millions of soldiers came home to ticker-tape parades, handshakes, and promises of a better future. He went home too. Like many veterans, he didn't talk about what he'd seen. He got a job, he got married, he tried to live a normal life. But the thing about the military, especially in that era, is that once you were in, it was hard to ever fully leave. He stayed in the Army Reserves. At the time, it probably seemed like a smart, practical decision. The Cold War was starting. Tensions were rising. The world didn't feel stable. Staying connected to the military meant steady pay and some sense of purpose. Then, in 1950, the phone rang. North Korea had invaded South Korea. The Korean War had begun. The Second War, Korea. This time was different. World War II had felt big and clear. There was a defined enemy, a sense that everyone understood why the war was happening. Korea was confusing. He was called back into active duty in his late 20s. Now, he wasn't a teenager anymore. He was older, more experienced, and already carrying memories from one war. Korea was brutally cold in a way Europe hadn't been. Winters were savage, equipment froze, weapons jammed, soldiers lost fingers and toes to frostbite. He fought in mountainous terrain where visibility was poor and ambushes were common. The enemy didn't always wear uniforms. Front lines shifted constantly. Sometimes, he said, you'd fight for the same hill over and over again. He rarely talked about combat, but he once mentioned how quiet it could get right before a firefight. A strange, unnatural silence where everyone knew something bad was about to happen. By the time the armistice was signed in 1953, he had been through another war. He came home again. He was in his early 30s now, and once again, he thought he was done. The years passed. America changed. Televisions became common, suburbs expanded, kids grew up listening to rock and roll instead of radio news bulletins. He raised a family, went to work, attended church, mowed his lawn on weekends. To neighbors, he was just another quiet man who didn't say much, but the army still knew his name. And in the early 1960s, the world began heating up again, this time in Southeast Asia, Vietnam. At first, it didn't seem like a real war. Advisors were sent, then more advisors, then combat troops. By the mid-1960s, America was fully involved, and once again, the army came calling. The Third War, Vietnam. By the time he was sent to Vietnam, he was in his early 40s. Think about that for a moment. Most of the soldiers around him were barely old enough to vote. Teenagers and men in their early 20s, many of whom had never left their hometowns. And here he was, a man old enough to be their father, strapping on gear and heading into a jungle war that felt completely alien compared to Europe or Korea. Vietnam was hotter, louder, more chaotic. The enemy was often invisible. Booby traps were everywhere. The jungle itself felt like it was trying to kill you. He served in a support and advisory role, using his experience to train younger soldiers and help coordinate operations. Even so, danger was constant. He didn't talk about firefights, but he did mention the sound of helicopters, how that noise never really leaves you once you've heard it enough times. He saw young men break under pressure. He saw others grow older in a matter of weeks. And unlike the wars before it, Vietnam didn't feel like it had a clear ending. When his tour finally ended, he came home for the last time. This time, he knew it really was over. Coming home to silence. The problem was, America didn't know what to do with Vietnam veterans. World War II vets came home as heroes. Korea was largely forgotten, but still respected. Vietnam was different. There were protests, anger, confusion, people arguing over whether the war should have happened at all. He didn't wear his uniform in public. He didn't talk about Vietnam. He didn't talk about Korea. He barely talked about World War II. To his family, he was just dad or grandpa. A man who liked routine, disliked crowds, and preferred sitting quietly rather than telling stories. If someone asked about the war, he'd change the subject. Why he never talked about it? People often assume silence means a lack of emotion. In reality, it's usually the opposite. For men like him, talking about war meant reopening doors they'd worked very hard to keep shut. It meant reliving moments they survived by forcing themselves not to feel too much at the time. There was also culture. Men of his generation weren't encouraged to talk about trauma. There were no support groups, no therapy sessions, no vocabulary for what we now call PTSD. You were expected to endure, to move on, to keep things inside. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't think his story was special. After all, he wasn't famous. He didn't win medals people recognized. He didn't see himself as a hero. He was just a soldier who did what he was told, 3 separate times. The weight of 3 wars. Fighting in 1 war can change a person forever. Fighting in 3, that leaves layers. World War II showed him how destructive humanity could be on a massive scale. Korea taught him how pointless and repetitive war could feel. Vietnam showed him how complicated, political, and morally confusing conflict could become. Each war stacked on top of the last, forming a lifetime of memories that never fully went away. Sometimes, family members noticed things. He didn't like fireworks. He woke up early, even when he didn't need to. He always sat facing doors in restaurants. Little habits that never quite made sense, unless you knew. Da Vinci, the quiet legacy. He lived a long life. He never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews, never stood up at reunions to tell dramatic stories. When he passed away, his family found an old box in a closet. Inside were a few medals, some faded photographs, a discharge paper from each war. 3 wars, 1 man. Only then did his grandchildren fully understand who he had been. Not just a grandfather, but a witness to some of the most violent chapters of the 20th century. Final thoughts. There are thousands of men like him, men whose names never appear in history books, men who didn't talk about what they endured because they didn't think anyone needed to hear it. But their silence doesn't mean their experiences didn't matter. It means they carried them alone. So the next time you meet an older veteran who shrugs when you ask about the war, remember this story. Sometimes the people with the most to say are the ones who say nothing at all. And sometimes survival itself is the greatest story ever told. Please kindly subscribe to this channel to get more stories like this. Thank you.